Hi, everyone. We're just giving people a moment to be let into the webinar, and then we'll get started. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Lauren Wenzel. I'm the director of NOAA's National Marine Protected Areas Center, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's webinar, which is brought to you by OCTO, the Open Communications for the Ocean. And today's topic is ecological considerations for managing fisheries within conserved areas. And so we have a great group of people here. I'm going to introduce them in just a moment, but today's webinar is going to explore the topic of fishing in different types of marine protected areas and conserved areas in the ocean. And we'll introduce a new dedicated IUCN WCPA task force that will address knowledge gaps and advance best practices for management. So we really look forward to your questions and comments, to you sharing your observations and experiences on this really important topic. So we are, going to have a lot of time toward the end of this presentation for questions, and we encourage you to use the chat or the Q&A to put your questions in. You don't need to wait until the end to do that. And we will certainly make sure to get to those questions after our presenters have shared with us. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our four speakers, and then we'll move ahead with the presentation. So Dr. Fabrice Stephenson is a quantitative marine ecologist at Newcastle University and vice chair of the marine theme of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas. Fabrice uses modeling approaches to study spatial biodiversity patterns and anthropogenic impacts such as fisheries and climate change to inform strategic policy approaches to managing the marine environment. Following a PhD from Newcastle University in 2016, he spent 7 years in New Zealand working for NIWA, Fisheries New Zealand, and the University of Waikato. He currently holds a NUACT fellowship at Newcastle University, where he leads an interdisciplinary research group focused on the use of ecosystem services and nature-based solutions for equitable conservation of multiple values under a changing climate. We also have Jenna Sullivan-Stack. Dr. Jenna Sullivan-Stack is a marine ecologist dedicated to finding and sharing evidence-based solutions to threats facing our ocean. She is currently a research associate at Oregon State University with the MPA project, which aims to help improve ocean protection outcomes by connecting marine, ecological, and social science and other ways of knowing with policy and management decisions. Jenna currently sits on expert groups organized by IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center and Protected Planet, and the National Ocean Protection Council. Since joining the Marine Conservation Institute in 2011, Beth Pike has focused on strategic development, outreach, planning, and data management for the Marine Protection Atlas at mpaatlas.org. She leads the Atlas's team's efforts to highlight areas that best protect and conserve the ecosystem through strong marine protection. As co-author of the MPA Guide, Beth has guided the integration of assessment criteria into the MPA Atlas database and website. She earned her master's in environmental management from Duke University and has researched right whales in the North Atlantic and humpback whales in the North Pacific. And she has a captain's license and worked as a captain, mate, and naturalist throughout Alaska, the Pacific Northwest, and the South Pacific, Mexico, and Hawaii. And our last speaker is Estradivari, who is a marine ecologist at the Leibniz Center for Tropical Marine Research, specializing in marine conservation, coral reef ecology, and impact assessment. Her work bridges research, policy, and conservation, focusing on strengthening marine management in the Coral Triangle and beyond. She has contributed to improving MPA effectiveness and advancing OECM recognition in Indonesia through inclusive, evidence-based processes. Her research assesses conservation impacts and promotes sustainable approaches that balance biodiversity protection and resource use. Estra works with governments, NGOs, academia, and international bodies to inform policymaking through robust scientific evidence and interdisciplinary collaboration. So I will now turn it over to Fabrice, our first speaker. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Lauren. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Fabrice, and I'm going to be starting off this talk today. I'll start off by giving us a brief overview of global fishing practices and impacts. This is by no means exhaustive. This is just going to be quite a high-level overview. I'll then introduce the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas and some of the guidance that they've already provided on fishing in protected areas, before passing on to Jenna, who'll talk about the MPA guide, and Beth and Estra to provide some examples of some key knowledge gaps before we finish up the presentation with an overview of this new task force that'll hopefully be addressing some of these knowledge gaps and also advancing best practices for management. As Lauren said, we hope to have plenty of time for a Q&A towards the end of the seminar. So fishing methods can be broadly split into two kind of categories. Static gears, so that's fishing gears that stay in one place effectively, they don't really move around, and that can be things like line fishing or trapping or static nets. And then we have mobile fishing gears, so this is where fishing gears moved around the water to actively catch the fish rather than staying in one place. And these gears often cover kind of larger areas and, generally speaking, are less selective for the species that they catch. So that can be things like purse seines, pelagic trawls, bottom water trawls, things like those. So there's lots of variations within each of these types of fishing gears. There's too many to go into here. This is just to give you a bit of an overview of what we're talking about when we're talking about marine fisheries. So when we think about ecological impacts from fishing, these can also be broadly split into two categories. Direct impacts, so that's things that are an immediate consequence of fishing, and indirect impacts. So these are kind of the secondary impacts that occur over longer time periods. Before we start on this, I should say that we acknowledge that sustainable fishing is really important and has lots of really important benefits in many parts of the world, that it can be the primary means for protein and also nutrition, that it's a very important part of many economies and also provide important local livelihoods. So we won't go into all the benefits of fishing here. We're thinking more about those ecological effects, since that most closely relates to conserved areas, which is the kind of the focus of what we're going to be talking about today. So foremost of these kind of direct fishing impacts is the removal of biomass for caught species. So that can be target species, in particular when overfishing occurs, where we deplete that fish population faster than they can reproduce. It can lead to the collapse of fish stocks, but also loss of biodiversity more generally. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide around indirect effects. We can also think of a direct impact of removal of non-target species. This is often bycatch, so that's the species that we're not intentionally targeting. And that can be big things, megafauna, like dolphins or turtles or seabirds, but it can also be lots of other fish, or fish that are undersized, or fish of different species that we're not targeting. And if we take out too much of the bycatch, it can cause kind of disruptions to the food web. Again, an indirect impact that we'll talk about in the next slide. We can also get ghost fishing. So this is where a fishing gear is discarded or lost, and it'll continue to fish, although it won't be retrieved. So here in this example, we've got a gill net that was discarded and has continued to ghost fish, has caught this hammerhead shark, and this particular fish won't be caught or landed, but it's dead. And then finally, for fishing gears that are fish close to or on the seafloor, we can get removal or damage to certain seafloor taxa. So, for example, bottom trawling is a good example. When that's undertaken on sensitive habitats, for example, corals, then we can get damage to those seafloor ecosystems. So here we have an example of some deep water corals in the South Pacific in areas that are unfished, lots of coral coverage and abundance there. And then this is a similar habitat, but following relatively high levels of bottom trawling pressure, and we can see lots of coral rubble and some of the trawl scars there. So I mentioned earlier, we get these other ecological effects, which we could categorize as indirect effects, so secondary effects or often delayed consequences of fishing. These are some of the hardest to understand, and to predict, but in many cases, they can also have the largest impacts. Okay, and so we talked a bit about overfishing and or high levels of bycatch. That can lead generally to ecosystem imbalance. So that's where we're removing a lot of the biomass from the system, and this can lead to changes in predator-prey relationships or changes in the dominance of different species within the ecosystem, which ultimately can lead to a shift in ecosystem type. Sometimes that can be permanent. We also talked about the direct impacts of fishing on the seafloor, and that can be important if those seafloor habitats are important for other species. So if we impair the structure and the function of those seafloor habitats, it can have knock-on effects to taxa that need those habitats. It can reduce local species diversity, but also abundance of the species that are using those habitats. And then finally, we can think about genetic impacts. So some types of fishing, especially if they're very selective, can lead to genetic changes in the population. A good example of that is that larger fish are caught with only smaller fish becoming more common, and genetically that becomes more common and can change the overall health of that population. But we can also think about reductions in genetic diversity, which is very understudied in the marine environment, which has been coined the silent extinction by colleagues. So the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas aims to develop and provide scientific, technical, and policy advice. Here I've provided some examples of 5 of some of these guidelines and guidance documents that are available online that provide guidance that's applicable to protected areas in general. That covers things like governance and assessing management effectiveness. And in many cases, this guidance is seen as leading the field and is applied internationally. So for example, we have these well-established definitions of MPA management categories, where each of these categories are based on the objectives of the protected area, so what we're trying to achieve with them. And they have different conservation objectives, which I guess limit to a certain extent the human activities that are permitted within them. So we get some types of MPAs, like strict nature reserves, that are primarily there and managed mainly for science, have high levels of strict protection and limit human activities within them, through to category 6, for example, managed resource protected areas that are managed mainly for sustainable use of natural ecosystems that allow a number of different activities within them. Of course, the key with all of these is that these activities need to be compatible with the conservation objectives. So there was some guidance on the compatibility of fishing and collecting activities in these different management categories. So as I mentioned earlier, for example, IUCN Management Category 1A, which is the top first row there. In terms of those fishing or collecting activities, none of those are compatible with 1A, except for some exceptions around collection for research. But then we can see as we progress down that table through to category 6, a greater number of activities are compatible with those objectives. I guess the thing is these categories are quite broad, so there's quite a lot of room for interpretation, and also I guess a potential lack of understanding of where different fishing types would fit within these broad categories. And so a couple of key points around MPAs in particular that I think will be useful for setting the scene for the rest of the talk is noting that there's a couple of these key considerations. The first is that all of these MPAs have as a core objective to conserve biodiversity. That's their primary objective. And that doesn't necessarily apply to OECMs in the same way. The second is that there's this column here, industrial scale fishing, which is not considered compatible with any of the IUCN MPA categories. And Beth will be talking a bit more about the definition of that and some of the considerations around that. And then finally, the IUCN does not recognize vertical zoning. So for example, protection of benthic areas, while allowing for incompatible fishing in the water column would not be considered appropriate. And again, Beth will provide some examples of that. So really the takeaway from this is that fishing does happen in MPAs. In fact, it's estimated that more than 90% of MPAs allow some form of fishing. As an example of this, more than 50% of the North European MPAs are considered more heavily trawled within the MPA boundaries than they are outside. And a 2018 study linked that to a 69% decline of sharks, rays, and skates between 97 and 2016 within those areas. So clearly, some forms of fishing are not compatible with conservation objectives. But there's still a lot of uncertainties. So we saw in that previous table that those categories were quite broad, and there's still a lot of uncertainty around which fisheries, so what kinds of fisheries, at what scales, and importantly, at what intensities align or don't with these conservation objectives. And I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Jenna.
Great. Thanks so much, Fabrice. And thanks to everybody for being here. I'm Jenna, Sullivan-Stack. I'm a marine ecologist at Oregon State University in the US. And I want to start with a little overview on one of the pieces of guidance that exists about human activities and MPAs and especially fishing that can be built on through this task force to help answer some of those key remaining questions that Fabrice raised and that Esther and Beth will also talk about. So I'm one of the co-authors on the paper on the previous slide, and thanks. This works, Fabrice, it's perfect. And this sets out, it's called the MPA Guide. It sets out a framework for understanding expected biodiversity conservation outcomes from different types of MPAs. As we heard from Fabrice, most MPAs are not actually closed off areas where people aren't going and having activities happen inside. And those activities can have different impacts on the biodiversity that lives there and different outcomes. So having this many different kinds of MPAs can lead to a lot of confusion around what any given MPA might be expected to provide. And that confusion is what led a large group of collaborators, led by the founding partners here, to get together and provide clarity using a framework called the MPA Guide. So the founding partners include these leading organizations that were, if you go back to the last one really quick, for tracking and assessing and providing guidance for MPAs globally. I'm sure many of you on this call are really familiar with them, but I just wanted to make sure that people don't think this is all my work. And you'll hear a lot more about MP Atlas from Beth soon, which is one of the founding partners. Okay, next slide. Thanks. So I don't have time to get into the MPA Guide in detail, and I imagine some of you have heard of it already. But the end result of the MPA Guide can be summarized in this matrix here. So the first element looks at the stage of establishment, which is about what stage an MPA area is on its way to being operational and in force in the water. So an MPA that's committed or designated might be talked about or exist in law, but it doesn't have an impact yet in reality in the water. And then an MPA needs to be implemented and ideally actively managed to accrue those biodiversity conservation benefits. That is the main objective of any MPA by definition. And then the level of protection is about how well protected the area is from the impacts of human activities. Minimally protected areas might have large impact activities happening, whereas highly and fully protected areas don't. And then there's another key element of the MPA Guide called enabling conditions. It's not in the matrix, but it's a key element of effectiveness and relates to processes and principles by which the MPA is created and managed. So transparency and communication or community engagement, aspects of ecological design of MPAs that we know are important, like their size and spacing if they're part of a network. And all of those link to the outcomes that can be expected out of an MPA. So one that is operational in the water and isn't impacted by high impact human activities would be expected to be better at recovering and sustaining that diverse biodiversity. Okay, next slide, Fabrice, thanks. So there, I don't have time to go into this in detail either, but I just wanted to highlight that there's a recent paper that a colleague, Barbara Horte-Costa led, that took a meta-analysis approach to linking the MPA Guide stage and level to real data on ecological outcomes. And using that same matrix, it showed that here for fish density and fish biomass, that stage and level are in fact good predictors of the conservation outcomes. So the next slide, we go into how you actually look at level of protection, which I'm sure is of interest to this group with that fisheries focus. We look across 7 different activities, not just fisheries, but also mining, dredging, dumping, anchoring, infrastructure, aquaculture, and non-extractive activities. And there's a very long document with detailed guidance about how you can determine using these different activities, what level of protection any given area is or zone within a multi-zone MPA. For example, for aquaculture, we know that not all aquaculture is the same. Some seaweed aquaculture, for example, might actually have benefits to biodiversity. And then something like industrial scale high density fish cages might have a really high impact such that they might not actually be compatible with biodiversity conservation. So I'll focus on the fishing activity and try and just give a brief overview of how what the guidance says to help determine what level of protection an MPA is based on what fishing is happening. If you go to the next slide. So the level of protection in the MPA guide is based on this earlier system, a regulation-based classification system for marine protected areas, published by some MPA guide co-authors, led again by Barbara Horta-Acosta. And they looked at the specific fishing regulations within an MPA. So what is allowed and not allowed to be used. And they found that looking at the number of different gears is actually a good predictor of what the impacts might be. And then thinking about what impact level those gears have and adding those up to get a final zone class. And then below this, I didn't put it on the slide, but you can look at the different zone classes within a multi-zone MPA, for example, and end up with a weighted average to get a final MPA classification. So that ranges from unprotected all the way through to fully protected. There's different classifications. So the MPA guide takes this system and takes elements of it. If you go to the next slide. So the MPA guide looks at things like the number of gears and the impact level of those gears and describes the level of fishing activity that's compatible with each of these 4 levels of protection, and also fishing that's has such a high impact that it would be incompatible with conservation, like Fabrice was saying before. So in fully protected areas, there's no fishing happening at all. And then fishing in highly protected areas would have a low impact, lightly would have a moderate impact, minimally would have a large impact. So I'm sure everyone is wondering how you tell if it's high or low or moderate impact. And there, if you go to the next slide, there's it's a combination of factors. So some gears are known to have higher impact than other gears. And this color-coded gear impacts table just summarizes which gears are likely to have low impact here in the green, moderate impact in yellow. And then on the next slide, there are some higher impact gears that are colored red and some gear that is incompatible with biodiversity conservation. And so anyone assessing an MPA area would need to not only think about the gear type itself, but also issues of scale and frequency and intensity to know that this is indeed a large impact, that is indeed a small impact. So for example, even hand captures or gleaning can be high impact if you are taking all of an endangered species in an area, for example. Okay, I know I'm running out of time. I'll maybe have the next slide. So I just wanted to share that there have been many assessments using the MPA guide that have been completed around the world. There's a paper linked here showing some of the results for some of these and the lessons learned from looking at MPA quality in these different areas. And the work of the task force would be really necessarily grounded in some of these real world examples, and we'll hear from Estra and Beth about some of those. For example, one of them was looking at the 100 largest MPAs globally, and Beth will talk about that in a minute. And yeah, actually, I think that's it for me, and I'll pass it off to Beth now. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks, Jenna. And I want to just thank everybody for joining us today, and thanks to Fabrice and all for the invite to participate both in the task force and in today's webinar. So next slide just kind of hones in a little bit on that decision tree from the MPA guide. The place that we'll be looking at here is that this guidance for fishing does have some places where we routinely come up against these kind of data gaps or maybe less clear guidance on how to apply impact to fisheries in MPAs. And so, as many folks on this call know, there's many different fisheries across the world. We want to add to this body of knowledge and help refine the scientific guidance for fishing impact in marine protected areas. Next slide. So the MP Atlas is the home for MPA guide assessments, where you work with partners and colleagues with specific NPA or regional expertise to help us grow the database. For NPAs evaluated for quality, we believe this gives us a tool to measure progress towards global targets that considers NPA effectiveness. And we use this tool daily and often attempt to apply fishing guidance for impacts in NPAs. Next slide. Last year, we published a paper that assessed the largest 100 NPAs that are reported to the World Database on Protected Areas. And industrial fishing was allowed in 1/3 of the NPAs, either because the activity is explicitly allowed or because vertical zoning allows it in the water column within the NPA. Next slide. One example of this is the offshore NPAs in Brazil, where they explicitly allow longlining, and the current guidance for industrial fishing comes from a WCC resolution that many folks here are probably aware of. I've highlighted the pertinent part at the bottom towards this NPA that any fishing that includes trawling gears dragged or towed across the seafloor or through the water column and fishing using purse seines and large longlines is defined as industrial fishing. Next slide. When you look at the Global Fishing Watch for this marine protected area, you can see that the offshore NPAs are heavily fished. And so we know that fishing is occurring, and we also know that longlining is explicitly allowed. So the assumption is that these are longliners operating in these zones. And so as a result, on the next slide, the zones of the environmental protection areas for these were assessed to be incompatible with biodiversity. And the next slide shows a different example from Mexico. And this is where vertical zoning comes in. So the IUCN has a strong presumption against the vertical zoning of NPAs. The reason for this is because there is known to be ecological interactions between the bottom, the water column, and the surface. And there is a strong case to be made for a precautionary approach to vertical zoning until there's more scientific evidence to support when and how this might be compatible with biodiversity. And I saw a question in the Q&A regarding IUCN and how they deal with countries who allow industrial fishing in their NPAs. And at this time, they're self-reported data, but the NPA guide, and as shown in the NPA Atlas, we do try to parse out the NPAs that do allow industrial fishing for just that reason. In this particular case, the NPAs in light green begin at 800 meters below the surface. And so on the next slide, if you look at the Global Fishing Watch, you can see that there is fishing within the NPA, specifically the most southeastern section. And we can assume that this is happening above the 800-meter level, though there's really no way to know for sure. So this also kind of brings into account the fact that enforcement of a vertical zoned area becomes difficult. And our next slide shows that per NPA guide and IUCN guidance, we've assessed these NPAs to be incompatible. There are actually NPAs that begin at 100 meters of depth, and there's others that only cover the bottom benthic area itself. So Marianas Trench in the US is only the seafloor protection. We actually expect to see more vertical zonation as OECMs become reported. In fact, the most recent high seas OECMs submitted by the Northeast Atlantic RFMO are for BME areas on the bottom only. So vertical zoning does continue to be a place where guidance needs to be increased. So that's all for me. I'm going to pass it to Estra, who's going to speak on the small scale fisheries aspect.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Estra from ZMT Germany, and thank you, everyone, for joining, especially those coming from Asia and Pacific, which is quite late now. So in this section, I'll focus on a key question: how does small-scale fishing inside conserved areas affect ecological outcomes? This is a topic that is gaining urgency and complexity. In the past few decades, we've made progress in understanding how small-scale fisheries interact with conservation goals. but evidence on biodiversity outcomes remain mixed and highly context dependent, especially with multi-use MPAs. So in the next few slides, I'll share key insights and remaining gaps using Indonesia as a case study. So as you can see here, Indonesia conserved area are really extensive, diverse, and mostly near shore, overlapping with the fishing ground used by the 90% of the country's fishers who are small scale. So this map here shows the distribution of government-led MPAs and potential OECMs that we identified 2 years ago. All MPAs allow fishing in up to 90%, but lack of specific fisheries regulation applied within MPAs. In contrast, more than half of potential OECM support small-scale fishing and are guided by local knowledge or sometimes cultural knowledge as well. They have diverse management system rooted in customary practices and vary widely in size, from under a hectare to over 300,000 hectares. Together, these conserved areas are vital for small-scale fisheries, but they also raise the question, how can we better align conservation policies with the realities and needs of these coastal communities? Next. Ecological outcomes in Indonesia vary significantly depending on how areas are managed. Based on our latest analysis, we see that gear restricted zone within MPAs, which is the second violin bar here, perform nearly as well as no-take zone within MPAs, and both much better than open access area. And in fact, over 40% of global target of 500 kilograms per hectare, compared to just 25% in open areas. Some of the highest fish biomass is interestingly found in remote reef areas, often far from markets and major population centers. However, remoteness alone doesn't guarantee protection. This area remains vulnerable without formal recognition and safeguards. Importantly, many of these remote sites are governed by long-standing local community practices, as we identified, which could potentially qualify as OECMs. Next. So now we look at how zone size and MPA age influence fish biomass based on data from multiple sites assessed using the MPA guide framework that Jenna mentioned before, which classifies the protection level from minimal to full protection. So in the top graph, the red circle you can see there shows that small zone with lightly or minimally protection can still perform well. But for larger zone, like in the blue square, only those with high or full protection consistently show positive outcomes. The bottom graph shows that herbivore biomass increases with MPA age, regardless the protection level, suggesting that long-term protection matters. However, this pattern doesn't hold for fisheries targeted species, which may require stricter rules or better enforcement. Overall, the key message is that success depends on not just on zoning, but on good design, strong protection, and time. Next. And this slide compares two government-led MPAs. So I'm going to give more detailed example from Kekecil and Alor MPA to show how similar management structure can result in different outcomes. And this is data just 3 years after the zoning was implemented. So in Kekecil, the top row, we see declines in both herbivore and fisheries targeted fish biomass. We also found limited positive fisheries impact, likely due to weak implementation or enforcement. And in contrast, the Alor MPA, the bottom row, shows stable or slightly increasing key fisheries fish biomass. But like Kekecil, Alor MPA also has limited positive fisheries impact, perhaps because 3 years is simply too short to see meaningful ecological recovery. The comparison highlights that zoning again alone is not enough. Local context, enforcement, and time, and many others are critical to achieving positive outcomes. Next. So the next example, I'm going to show you how community co-management can contribute to ecological outcomes. In some Indonesian MPAs, customary communities co-manage certain zones, especially in the use zone, with the authority to regulate and fish exclusively in their areas. In our MPA, as an example here, customary marine tenure was formally recognized and applied through a seasonal open-close system within the MPA use zone. And after 3 years, invertebrate density increased inside the customary zone, but declined outside. Key fish species also rebounded, and 96% of fishers reported improved catch and income during open seasons. Importantly, many strong local and customary fishery systems like this also exist outside MPA, so not only in MPAs. And recognizing these areas as IUCN indeed could support sustainable fishing by valuing local practices and helping protect important areas over the long term. Next. So this is my last slide. So to close, here are some key takeaways. We've seen that fishing is widespread in conserved areas, especially in multi-use MPAs and potential IUCN. While we know now more what influence outcomes like zone design, enforcement, time, and many more, big uncertainties remain. There's no one-size-fits-all approach, and fishing outcomes vary widely depending on local context, governance, and many other factors. And there are many key knowledge gaps remain, such as what type of fishing are truly considered low impact, how do we differentiate them from industrial operation in practice, what level of fishing pressure can this area sustain ecologically, especially when small-scale use is dominant, how do we measure long-term ecological and social outcome in places with limited monitoring capacity, and many more. And these are the kind of gaps our new IUCN WCPA task force is trying to address, and we hope this conversation helped to move that forward. So I'm going to give this back to Fabrice.
Thanks, Estra. So as mentioned, there's been this new task force that's been set up. So it's a joint IUCN WCPA and MPA guide task force on fisheries and conserved areas. This idea and the setting up of the task force basically came from a workshop that was run in October 2024 at the International Marine Conservation Congress in Cape Town that was developed and led by Sue Wells. And from that workshop, there were several key recommendations that came out of some of these gaps and uncertainties that we've been kind of talking about today. So it's pretty clear that we needed to better account for fishing intensity when considering fishing impacts. There was lots of ideas around how that could be done, but a risk-based approach was considered maybe one approach that could deal with some of the complexity of ecosystems where guidance would be more linked towards likely fishing impacts and therefore further kind of exploration. But there was also discussion about this definition of industrial fishing and whether it applies in practice, how and where, and whether it's suitable for these offshore MPAs. So the QR code there will take you to a webpage that describes the task force or the aims of the task force, as well as some information about how you can join it. So we're trying to achieve three things with the task force. The first is to follow up on IUCN Resolution 55 on industrial fishing, especially with the context of the high seas. So how do we apply this definition of industrial fishing in the high seas, but more broadly to MPAs and OECMs? There'll be a task on developing a risk-based approach that considers these likely fishing impacts and trying to do that for a variety of different fisheries that applies internationally, but also at local regional scales. And then finally, to review and update any guidance as necessary on MPAs and OECMs.
Sorry. I'm assuming you're passing it to me. So we would like to welcome anybody on this call and anybody that you know that we should extend the invite to participate in the task force. We anticipate there being various levels of participation based on capacity and expertise. We're thinking initially maybe a larger mailing list that kind of keeps people in the loop versus subgroups that maybe work on specific subsets of the data. It's not all going to draw from the same level of expertise. So we're going to put up a short poll, and the poll is going to ask you to give us an idea on whether or not you would like to be included. And so there is actually an opt-out version, so you can complete the poll and then ask never to be contacted again, which would be terrible. But if you'd like to select a level of participation, give us a little insight into your expertise so we might have an idea where specifically you might interact, and then also a little bit about the group that you work with. So we've kept it really simple. We think we can keep the poll open through the Q&A. So you should have between now and the end of today's session to fill this in, and all of these will be collated and sent to us. And so unless you've selected, please don't add me to the email list. You'll be hearing from us. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much to our speakers, Fabrice, Jenna, Beth, and Estra. That was great. And thank you so much for sharing the references as requested. That's super helpful to be able to get into those papers. So I wanted to go ahead and turn to some of the questions, and I'll let you all let me know who would like to respond to these. But one is about the trade-offs between conservation and food production. If we move toward 30% highly protected instead of a full spectrum of protection, what are the impacts on global food production in the short and long term? And what is the difference in the lag between protection and recovery? So basically looking at what are those trade-offs between a suite of protection and fully protected on food production. I don't know if anyone would like to take a crack at answering that.
Can we turn to you, Estra?
Yeah, so in Indonesia, because a lot of fishers are small scale and they are really highly dependent on resources, so the government decided when they try to designate conserved area, they should focus on sustainable fisheries beside the conservation. So it become a trade-off. In Indonesia, we don't have any MPAs that is fully protected, like natural reserve, for example. But all of them are multi-use MPAs, and only around 10% of the MPAs area are designated for no-take area, and the other 90% it can be used for many other things as long as they are sustainable. So there's also that. So we decided this trade-off because of local context, and we believe that even though we protect only 10% of the MPAs as note, they can still provide outcomes, especially for so basically we can see that multi-use MPA still can provide ecological outcome and provide social outcome as well, including income and food production. But again, maybe not as much as the fully protected MPAs.
All right, thanks very much. Okay, here's another question. While there's a lot of research on benthic impacts of bottom trawling, I wonder if panelists have any insights on the benthic impacts or other ecological impacts of mid-water trawling and whether or not to permit this activity in conservation areas. Anyone want to take a stab at that one?
I mean, I can say something to it, which I think is that's one of the big gaps in evidence. I'm not aware of very many studies that have looked at that. I think that the guidance from the IUCN WCPA perspective is that because it's uncertain, we should take a precautionary approach. That said, I think especially in the high seas where there are benthic protected areas for example, vulnerable marine ecosystems or VMEs that are very deep water, then there may be questions about pelagic fisheries that are operating in a couple of 100 meters of water, and the level that is having an impact on those seafloor communities. But my understanding is that that's not very well explored, certainly not experimentally. But I'd welcome anybody that has any knowledge that's on the chat to pop in a reference or something similar if there is that information available. Don't know if anybody else wants to follow up, Beth.
I was just going to mention that the Marine Conservation Institute submitted a WCC resolution for a precautionary approach to mesopelagic fisheries for exactly this reason. So, and I believe that is open for comment right now. Is that where we're at in the process? So please go in and find our resolution, and if you want to support it, we're looking for support.
As I understand really fast, just the impacts that I think we were looking at were depending on the exact the exact environment and all of that. There could be bycatch, there can be overfishing of forage fish, for example, or some of those connections that we know need to be more well characterized between the water column and the bottom can be disrupted. So yeah, definitely a research gap, but still some is known about some impacts, I think.
Okay, great. Thanks. And thanks for that information, Beth, about the current opportunity people have to weigh in on that question. Another question, how does the IUCN deal with countries that allow industrial fishing within MPAs? Do you still recognize these areas, or do you flag them in any way, or provide feedback to the relevant park authorities? I realize we don't have someone here from the World Database on Protected Areas, but I don't know if anyone has interacted with this issue who might comment.
Yeah, they don't, it's a self-reported data set, and they don't have the capacity or the mandate to flag those things. So we see it as a role of the NP Atlas actually to help with that. So it's part of why we exist.
All right. Here's another comment and question. This is such great work, and I'm looking forward to seeing how the task force advances understanding. I'm wondering if the focus on the fishery without a corresponding focus on where it's happening, in other words, what habitat, if it's benthic or pelagic, is taking place, if that could be misleading. Can we really say that all bottom trawling or purse seining is destructive if it's on a heavily trawled sandy bottom, for example? Then the person notes, I'm not claiming to know, just wondering if we need to give attention to this issue. And that we also, the MPA community needs to be thinking about the bigger picture, such as fishing displacement effort. Otherwise, we would be putting our heads in the sand regarding unintended consequences. Any comments or responses on that?
I can jump in. I think they're all very good points. And I think that this I think at the moment, although it's still very early days, we envision that this risk-based approach would account for some of those habitat-specific or vulnerability-specific considerations. So I think absolutely relevant to consider the impacts given the environment. And so we welcome input on this work related to that risk assessment, because I think it's going to be a big task.
Yeah, and nothing has got started, and I know that there's work underway, for example, at FAO, that's very well developed, thinking about OECMs and fisheries, and so making sure that things are aligned and work isn't duplicated, and we're providing a useful way of thinking for MPAs that is corresponds with other ways of thinking for areas outside of MPAs will be really important in the task force. So please join so we can all keep conversations together. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think just some information from some of our listeners. In Quebec, most fishing boats correspond to the IUCN definition of industrial fishing according to the size criterion. And in Italy, there's a term semi-industrial fishing that's sometimes used to describe boats who are over 12 meters in length, but do not necessarily carry out industrial type activities. So I think this person is just pointing out the complexities and nuances with the term industrial fishing. And also another listener commented that we published a report last year where we exposed that only 0.014% of Spain's marine waters are fully or highly protected. So just noting the relative lack of highly protected areas. All right, another question. This seems like a lot of work. Yes, clearly it is. How do you source your regulatory information? And I think asking particularly in relation to the MPA guide.
Yes, it is a lot of work. That's why we haven't done it for all 16,000 MPAs. Yeah, so it takes a long time to apply an MPA guide assessment because it's not based simply on regulations in place, but also in situ activities. So as I showed, those overlays of Global Fishing Watch can be really helpful to kind of show and illustrate the type of activities that are happening that you might want to be looking for when you then go to a zone and look for its level of protection or whether it's mitigating certain threats. So we actually don't do all of these assessments ourselves. I feel like I should put that out there. These assessments are done by people with expertise regionally, and we work with them to try and pull the data in and create kind of this central resource. So if you have an area that you have expertise in, we're always more than willing to share the tool that we've built and get more people to help us. I would also mention two other pieces. One, every single assessment is a snapshot in time, because fisheries regulations and mining regulations and every political will change. And so sometimes NPAs, and we always think of NPA growth as a linear up, but as we're seeing in the US, it can go down. So coverage is not always going to increase. And the last thing I want to mention is target 3 is one of many targets. So when you have a sustainable fishery, you do not have to have it in an NPA that is designed for target 3. It could be in one of these sustainable areas. In fact, 70% of the ocean we're not talking about should be sustainably managed for fishing. And so it's not a requirement that every community participate in a target 3 area. If they need to have use in that area, then they should have it. So it's a global target intended to kind of have a very varied portfolio of NPAs and protections in managed areas. We're only discussing target 3. And in those cases, biodiversity is the reason that it's there. And so that's where this industrial fishing and sustainable fishing starts to get sticky, is there's other targets to consider here. And it's possible that it's meant to be in that target.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. So just while we're on that subject, another question, just to throw a controversial question into the mix. In your opinion, should all forms of fishing activities, including mobile bottom gear, bottom trawls and dredges, for example, be banned from NPAs of all IUCN levels? And does that, is that the part of the definition of industrial fishing that is included in that resolution?
Yes, I think so, Lauren. So I think any bottom trawl gear is considered industrial fishing. So I don't think it would be compatible within the IUCN MPA management categories or the definitions of those. In terms of the compatibility of fishing within these different types of MPAs or OCMs, I think there's still this big gap around effort. So we still have these, what we might call destructive fishing gears. Obviously, a small amount of effort with those can result in a large impact, but we also have these low impact gears where a large amount of effort can also result in large impacts. So I think there's a lot of complexity to it, and I think it would be really useful to get some really clear guidance on that. But
Fabrice.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but can we bring the slide back up that had the QR code for the poll? Some people have lost the ability to go to the poll, so maybe we could just bring it up so folks can grab it if they need to.
I don't think the QR code was for the poll. I think that was just for the task force.
Okay, sorry.
The poll is separate, so maybe Sarah can help with the poll.
I can get another QR code that is for the poll and send it to you. I guess I can't post it in the chat. So it would need to go on a slide. Let me send it to you.
The poll is still open, right?
Yeah, but some people aren't seeing all the options.
We could probably send a link or a code to everybody who joined if you were unable to grab it the first time around. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds like a great option. Okay, we had a question around how do we bring in how do we meaningfully incorporate traditional ecological knowledge as a core management strategy, especially in support of Indigenous and local fishing communities who rely on these waters for cultural subsistence and economic purposes? Estra, I don't know if this is one you'd like to speak to.
Yeah, actually, there are many papers out there how to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge, because there are a lot of MPAs based on customary management. Like in Indonesia, many areas are initially customary managed, but then it was transformed to MPAs. But again, when we're talking about traditional ecological knowledge, sometimes it doesn't end up as MPAs. We can also think that area to be designated as OECM as well. But actually, there are many ways out there to make sure this kind of knowledge can be integrated into MPAs or OECM design.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Another question, does the new task force envision including attention to connectivity needs of fish where their habitat may extend beyond a designated MPA?
I think that's a great idea, and we know connectivity is incredibly important for effectiveness. So I think we're open to including things like that in what we're looking at in terms of fishing impacts. Yeah, sounds great.
All right, so encourage that person to respond and find out more about the task force. That would be great.
Yeah.
So this is a question, I think, in relation to the MPA guide, asking, are mariculture activities within MPAs, such as scallop mussel and oyster farming, seaweed production, et cetera, also analyzed as activities having potential negative impacts in MPAs? And I know you mentioned this, Jenna, and do you have any recommendations regarding these activities?
Yeah, it's one of one of the activities that's considered alongside fishing is aquaculture, mariculture. And it can have a wide range of impacts. It's not a one size fits all, like everyone has been saying. It depends on what habitat type the aquaculture installation is in, what the density is, what if it's being fed or not fed, because a lot of times the feeding aquaculture species introduces a lot of impacts. And so there's a lot to unpack with that and a lot of research out there. You could start with looking at what's in the MPA guide, level of protection, the expanded guidance you can find it on the MPA guide website where it talks about some of these things. And then, there's a lot of resources out there we could connect on that I could share with you.
Great. That's really helpful. I'm just trying to take a look at the chat here. Make sure we're not missing anyone's comments. Yeah, I think, okay, we also have a comment from Protected Seas that just notes, this is terrific work. If everyone would find it useful to their research from the regulatory perspective, the Protected Seas Navigator platform is a robust and comprehensive platform that contains this information. And they have put together area-based information on regulations and management for over 20,000 areas in 200 countries and have a lot of translation information. And they've gone ahead and put that link in the chat. So thanks for that. All right, and then we do have a few comments just about categories of fishing. I'm sure that you all will have a lot of discussions about this around destructive artisanal small-scale fisheries. And I think just noting that sometimes small-scale fisheries can be destructive, such as dynamite fishing. And I don't know if you all have any comments about how you might address that.
Yeah, I think things like dynamite fishing, we've been considering incompatible, like a type of fishing that would be incompatible with biodiversity conservation and a way like pointing that out. Yeah, if anybody is aware of a version that isn't highly destructive, it would be great. And then, but thinking about artisanal fishing in general, agreed. And kind of like Fabrice was saying, the scale and frequency and intensity and everything is such an important factor in what the overall impact is. And then also thinking about food security and all of those things factor in different parts of the world too. So I think that's part of the need for the task force that we've identified is looking at that in more detail and providing more useful guidance at that scale. And then at things like the industrial fishery scale, I've seen a lot of comments about how that term hasn't been helpful and the resolution needs to be looked at. So that's definitely on the agenda too.
Yeah, thanks for noting that, Jenna. I do see a couple of comments about the term industrial fishing and just the importance, Esther, you talked about this, of how important it is to look at management and enforcement of fishery management rather than just what types of activities may be regulated, actually how that implementation occurs. So yes, I think that's obviously an area that people have raised. You just see here.
And this is maybe a little bit too late, but I think I'm posting a link in the chat, which should go to the poll for anyone who wanted to answer but wasn't able to.
Wonderful. So thanks for doing that, Sarah. And I know we're at time. So maybe while people click on that chat, that link.
And it's possible I haven't had this exact scenario happen, but it's possible that they may be able to answer the poll after the webinar. I don't know.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say that that we are at time, and I know some people may need to wrap up here. I was going to see if our speakers had any closing comments they wanted to make briefly, and then we could maybe just stay on and leave the poll open for a couple of minutes.
Just thanks for being here and hope to see you at our task force. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And thanks to our speakers.
Thanks, everyone. We'll keep it open, but I'll stop the recording.
All right. Sounds great.